Is there hope, Robin? That would be the question. Is there hope?
For the BBC, no, I don't think.
Okay.
Um, I don't think so. I don't think that the BBC can be brought to a different view of how society should be. I think the BBC, as I said before, I think it is wholly wedded to a progressive agenda.
Robin Aitken, what a joy to speak to you again. For those of you who don't know you, you are, of course, a former BBC journalist from the Today programme, amongst other programmes, no less, and also an author of some wonderful material. If nobody's read The Noble Liar, I would recommend they go and read it. It really does talk an awful lot of sense about the BBC, about the mistakes they've made, the direction they should be going, from somebody who really knows what he's talking about. Robin, it's such a joy to speak to you again.
And to you, Tony.
Now, today, we're talking to you because the BBC have been at it again. They've produced another multi-part series, What It Feels Like for a Girl, which, of course, is played by a man, written by a man who calls himself a woman. And it's been lambasted as, again, promoting transgenderism and glorifying transgenderism to young people. And I wonder, Robin, first of all, how does the BBC account for itself promoting this sort of stuff in the way it does so regularly? This isn't a sole example of it doing that very recently.
Well, the thing is, Tony, that it doesn't feel the need. The BBC doesn't feel the need to account for itself or justify itself in those terms. The BBC rides the waves of fashionable opinion, and it commissions dramas like this one, which, in its view, have something important to say as well as being entertaining, I suppose. One of the long-standing frustrations of dealing with the BBC, if you're a critic of it, is that it doesn't engage with its critics. It simply prefers to ignore us and gets away with it because it cannot be held accountable in any real sense. So I think probably this particular drama, I imagine, must have been commissioned, well, certainly well before the Supreme Court
Oh,
judgment
yes.
about access to single-sex spaces by uh, trans men. So I think, in that sense, I suppose that there is a question about whether the BBC would commission this now, today, um, given that we've had that quite clear ruling from the Supreme Court. But it wouldn't at all surprise me if they did, because this is very much in line with their progressive and liberal outlook on life, really.
You mentioned it rides the wave of populism, but does it ride it, or does it create the wave? Does it seek to actually create the wave in the first place? And that's a really big question. I think people have written in the past about the overrepresentation of LGBT, for example, members among its senior managers and its editorial staff. And so the question has to be, is it riding the wave, or is it actually seeking to influence and create it in the first place?
Well, it's long been my view, Tony, that the BBC has has molded public opinion into the shape which it desires. I mean, the BBC has been at the forefront of shaping public opinion on things like gay rights, on things like transgenderism, and a whole host of other issues. And it always comes down on the liberal and progressive side of the equation. And the idea that uh, it is simply reflecting society back to us is a nonsense. Um, the BBC is still, although it's a declining force in terms of its influence in the UK media, because fewer people are watching it,
Yes.
particularly
Yeah.
young people, as it happens,
Yeah.
and a lot of people are refusing to pay their license fee, understandably so. Even so, it does occupy a very prominent place in our media, and of course, what the BBC, um, what the ideas the BBC promotes and promulgates, these are given a huge boost if the BBC gets behind them. So I think that the BBC has, I mean, I term it, I say that the BBC has groomed the nation to accept certain things which once upon a time were not acceptable.
Yeah, and that's quite a powerful thing, Robin. And in terms of responsibility, I mean, we know that promoting, encouraging, glorifying transgenderism can lead to puberty blockers, can lead to surgery, which affects children's lives permanently. And I think we know now that these are irreversible effects that these drugs and things create. Where's the BBC's responsibility in all this, in thinking about what it's doing to a younger generation and the harm it's putting them at risk of?
Well, you might well wonder, and it's a very good question. But as I said at the start of this conversation, the BBC is not beholden to anyone in those terms. I mean, I think that the actively encouraging and promoting transgenderism in the way it has is a very damaging thing, and that individual lives will have been irremediably ruined by having been encouraged down the path into surgical interventions or puberty blockers, as you mentioned. You know, these things, their long-term effects are unknown, their psychological effects are really unknown and unforeseeable in many ways. And I think it seems to me to be, I think it's very irresponsible of the BBC to be promoting this kind of thing. I have to say that the program we're talking about, it's an 8-parter, and I have to admit I didn't manage to consume all 8 hours of it, but I did watch quite a lot of it. And what struck me about it was the sheer squalid and sordid nature of the program. It's about a young boy. He's in his teenage years when the thing starts.
Yep.
He is gay. He starts selling himself for sex in public lavatories. He then falls in with a group of sexually diverse types in a nightclub, and there's a lot of drug taking, there's a lot of casual sex, there's a lot of promiscuity. Interestingly, what struck me about it is that all that, the male prostitution, the drug taking, the casual sex, the promiscuity, all of that is presented in a way which is, you might say, value free. So there is no judgment involved. In fact, we are invited as the audience to sympathize entirely with the central character and all the characters who surround him, except for his parents, who are a feckless couple. The father is, I suppose, what would be known as a toxic masculine figure. The mother is feckless and promiscuous herself, neglectful. The picture that the program presents is of a young man who is drawn towards homosexuality. He embraces that, and then he begins to see himself actually as someone who should be a woman. The destination point is that this young person then transitions to become a woman. And that destination is, of course, a fictional destination and an unreal destination. This is the point that, you know, the Supreme Court underlined, that there is a biological reality to sex, and that biological reality is something that cannot be bought simply by puberty blockers or by wish fulfillment or by surgical intervention.
Yep. Yep.
You are,
Yep.
you know, either male or female, except,
Yep.
Let's be clear, there is a very, very tiny number of people who are born with intersexual characteristics.
Chromosomal disorders, etc. Yes, absolutely right. Yeah.
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 But
we're not talking about that.
A simple blood test on any of us would reveal whether we're male or female. It is written in our genome, and there is nothing you can do about it. We are, you know, sadly for those people who wish to change their sex, we are a binary species, and for a good reason, because we are male and female to procreate, and that is the truth of it.
And you raised the point I was going to raise, the fact that they're normalizing some pretty squalid behavior in society, which again stems from the whole idea that the only thing that matters is consent. And you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whoever you want. And really, there is no morality. There are no moral absolutes. There's no objective better ways of living or worse ways of living. Anything goes. Do anything you want. Yet the evidence we know speaks exactly opposite. That growing up with a married mum and dad, biological married mum and dad, the idea that if you save sex for marriage, your marriage and your life becomes happier, and your results end game becomes much more of a much more shinier perspective on a population basis. All these things we know unequivocally, and it's not marginal, it's a significant difference. Yet the BBC just won't talk about that at all, which is really bizarre.
It is, except for the fact that the BBC is wholly invested in exactly that agenda. I mean, if you want to look at this in the historical medium term, let's say from the 1950s, there has been a relaxation of all those rules which once upon a time the majority of people accepted, and of course they were honored in the breach. I'm not naive enough to pretend that everything in the garden was rosy. Of course it was not. I mean, that old cliche that Christians always trot out to each other. We are all sinners. Of course, we know that, and it's clear that people were not saints back in the 40s and the 30s. Of course they weren't, and they never have been. That's the point. But what we did have was a framework of public morality, which reinforced the idea of self-restraint and the idea of a morality which was based on Christian precepts. That is, that you don't, the promiscuity, indecency, these things are to be avoided if we possibly can. And, we must, and of course, if that is built into the culture, if that is what you get reinforced when you turn on the radio or read a book or whatever, if that is reinforced, then what you end up with is a society which by and large sticks to those rules, or at least aspires to stick to those rules. I mean, since then, what has happened has been that all those rules have been jumped, so that, and the BBC is really culpable in this particular regard, because it has been one of the battering rams which has knocked a huge hole in that public morality. So that, as you say now, everybody makes up their own rules, and the rules they make up for themselves are, needless to say, quite lax. Do you know, Tony, it's last week, I was on holiday, and one of the books I read whilst away was Aldous Huxley's 1930s novel, A Brave New World. I reread it actually because I must have read it 50 years ago. The point is that he was on the right track, because all those things which he describes in his novel are things which are innately attractive to people. Satisfying one's sensual needs, satisfying one's sexual needs, being healthy, and being happy. These are what we all imagine we want to be. And of course, it was a prophetic warning, that book, and a warning which we have entirely ignored, because we have actually constructed a society where these are exactly the things which young people are taught to want.
And some would argue, in fact, he didn't have a concept of online social media, but to a great extent, that is the dystopia into which many of our young people have now gone and retreat and live, and where they get their happiness from.
Absolutely. I mean, some of his imaginings seem now to us quite quaint. He did imagine the idea of a ubiquitous universal television, but he had no notion of the internet or handheld devices, telephones, where you could get anything under the sun. at the touch of a button. So he wasn't there.
It's fair to say, Robin, that the BBC aren't the only organisation doing this. ITV have recently brought out a similar series on a similar theme. The difference is, of course, the BBC are paid for by you and me and others who subscribe to the licence fee, not by advertising. So from that point of view, and they have a charter, a national public charter to promote the good of the nation, and this clearly is not that. So is there a solution? I mean, where do we go from here? Do we just wait until it languishes in mediocrity and then demises through lack of funds, or is there something that can be done?
Well, you make a good point anyway, that it isn't the BBC solely which is promoting this kind of stuff. It is there are many other media organisations which do the same or worse, and so it is not. It isn't entirely in the hands of the BBC. What happens, though, to the BBC? Well, its charter is up for renewal in 2027, and there are serious doubts about whether it can continue to be funded by the licence fee. And there are all sorts of ideas floating around about how the licence fee might be replaced, or how the BBC might in future be funded.
Is there hope, Robin? That would be the question. Is there hope?
For the BBC, no, I don't think.
Okay.
I don't think so I don't think that the BBC can be brought to a different view of how society should be. I think the BBC, as I said before, I think it is wholly wedded to a progressive agenda, and it has been for many decades, and that isn't going to change. So in that sense, no, there is no hope. Is there hope more generally? Of course there is.
Oh, yes.
Of course there is more generally. And because what I think about that agenda and the way that this particular series particularly exemplifies all those things which we think are bad. The point is that I think that that people will eventually come to understand that these things which are being sold to them as goods, these things which are being sold to them, they are sold for their own benefit, are not. And that is where hope must reside. That in time, the pendulum will swing, and we will say, as a society, we understand that pornography is not a good idea. We understand that marital breakdown is bad for society, and particularly bad for children, because these things are out there and staring us in the face.
You're absolutely, and I often cite a book by a lady called Kimberly Ells, The Invincible Family, and she makes the very same point that actually we know from the evidence now also that in Brad Wilcox's work and other work that statistically the happiest people in the world are married with children. And we've got evidence that Gen Z are looking at this now and thinking more and more of them, well, actually, I want that. I want to be able to settle down with one person and be happy. This hedonism doesn't seem to work for me. And so you're right. And our job in the meantime is to hopefully try and limit the amount of damage, to stop the rate of decay or prevent it as much as we possibly can. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. The future is bright. Can I finish on your excellent book, The Noble Liar? And I think the last time we spoke, you were toying with the idea of a version 2, an updated version. How's that going?
Well, actually, I'm involved in another writing project at the moment. So I have another book on the slopeway. In very broad outline, it's about the real definition of progress, and perhaps just referring back to your question there, the idea that what would progress look like to us? What does progress look like to those of us who are Christian or socially conservative? What progress would look like to us would be a return to values which our forefathers held dear, and a rejection of the sort of values which the BBC is so keen on promoting. Is that an entirely far-fetched idea? I don't think it is. I think that actually people can be persuaded and shown that a return to those values is good for them, good for their children, good for their families, and as you say, will make them happier.
That's the thing. Yeah. And if they really want happiness, they're being sent down the wrong road.
They are.
Wake up and realize.
Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Great. Robin Aitken, it's always such a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading that. And it's good news if anybody hasn't bought your book, The Noble Liar. There isn't a version 2 coming out anytime soon. So go and buy that and read that because it's absolutely wonderful. Robin, thanks so much for your time.
Tony, thank you. Thank you so much.